I decided it might be fun to talk about the various editions of D&D and what I have drawn from them. I have a complicated relationship with D&D, the game. I, of course, appreciate it tremendously for having launched the hobby, but there's a lot of things about D&D specifically that I have never liked, even back into the earliest 80s when I became familiar enough with them to recognize that I didn't like them. Most of these things have remained part of D&D from the beginning, and I therefore, like I said, have a complicated relationship with it. I like games that operate much like D&D in many respects. I like the idea of the classes, the levels, the hit points, a lot of the armor class, a lot of the stuff that people who look for other mechanical systems complain about D&D. I actually don't mind really at all. In fact, I kind of tend to prefer them. So, if you look at like a skill-based non-level system like RuneQuest or basic role-playing or Savage Worlds, perhaps. I don't have as much interest in them. That said, there's a lot of things about D&D, some of which are related to those items, which I don't like. I don't like that it changes genre as you change levels. I think the whole idea that 5e claimed to support of bounded accuracy, whereas you went up in level, the game didn't fundamentally change. It was still kind of the same. You became more powerful, but you were still threatened by the same things at every level in some ways. I like that idea, but I don't know that the implementation of it in 5e was very good. So that's one of the things I don't like. I don't really like the way magic works in D&D. This has become worse in modern versions of D&D, by which I mean 3rd edition and above, than it was in older editions. But frankly, it's true in all editions of D&D that magic has always been too convenient, too mechanistic. You just kind of learn it and rattle it off. It's not mysterious at all. It basically turns characters into superheroes. And if you don't think that old school, old-fashioned D&D was also heavily based on superheroes, you haven't been paying attention. The older games that preceded D&D or came out alongside of it, like the Dungeon board game, for example, were clear that superhero was a class of character, a type of character. And Chainmail had heroes and superheroes, and Dungeon had heroes and superheroes. And much of the art of some of the earlier games of D&D was very, very comic book influenced and deliberately designed to look very superheroic. I prefer a different tone, a different feel, a different mood, and some different mechanics. So there's a lot of things that I've borrowed from games other than D&D that I've brought into the game. But let me first just talk about, let me go through the various editions of D&D, and I'm going to show some covers. I don't know that I'm going to necessarily make any effort to line them up with what I'm talking about. I'm just going to kind of put them in order and have them cycle through. Chainmail and Braunstein were the games that preceded D&D. Braunstein was, of course, never published. It was just a game that some people in the northern Midwest were playing, where they kind of ran these domains and had these characters that kind of did stuff. It became something that Dave Arneson, one of the co-writers and co-creators of D&D as we know it, was using. He was kind of borrowing from it, and he borrowed from Gary Gygax's miniature war game Chainmail to kind of create what is essentially the first D&D game. And Gary Gygax went out there and saw it and thought, boy, there's a lot of potential here, and the two of them collaborated to basically create D&D. So the idea was that Dave Arneson took this chainmail rules, which was kind of individual skirmish miniature games, but where you had an individual rather than a side that you commanded. And you just kind of ran through these adventures. They were very tactical, dungeon-based for the most part, and domain-based. I don't know, the domain-based play kind of never really caught on. The dungeon-based tactical play kind of became the default, however, for D&D, unfortunately, in my opinion, because it bears no resemblance to anything in the literature which supposedly informed the D&D game. Anyway, this kind of eventually in 1974, I guess, was published as the very first D&D game, and it was very garage band kind of feel, very amateurish in many ways. They didn't have a lot of money. They just got some friends to do some artwork, which was really amateurish and in fact kind of deliberately pastiche-like of a number of comic book arts. And this kind of later became a bit of an issue when it became obvious that they had literally copied some comic book art. The cover of the first D&D book, in fact, was based on a panel from a Doctor Strange comic from the late 60s. D&D, the first game was very opaque, I think. If you weren't already pretty familiar with the conventions of the wargaming crowd that he wrote it for, you probably had a hard time kind of understanding exactly what you were supposed to do. Although I think that even so, it kind of inspired the imagination, and people kind of gradually added their own interpretations of what you're supposed to do with it, because the game itself didn't give you a lot. In fact, ironically, it made literal reference to other games, sometimes created by competitors, that you were supposed to use to play. So, for example, you were supposed to use chainmail for combat, but D&D had an alternative system. That chainmail thing was very quickly abandoned, and the D&D combat gradually expanded to become the D&D combat that we know. And also, you were supposed to use some Avalon Hill game about wilderness survival for overland travel. This also eventually, rules for wilderness exploration, hex crawling, overland travel, whatever you want to call it, made their way into D&D, but this didn't happen for many years. So, old D&D was literally the first game that I played in the D&D line, which is appropriate. It was the first game in the D&D line. But at the time, I wasn't really very interested in it, to be perfectly honest with you. And the guy who was trying to run it for me is a friend of mine. We were kids. He didn't know what he was doing. I wasn't particularly interested, so I was kind of blowing him off and trying to play with his Star Wars toys collection. And I don't know that I can say that had a huge impact on my later love of the hobby, but if I'd been paying attention, I might have recognized that there was something about that I was really kind of interested in. And a couple years later, when D&D kind of started to hit its mainstream popularity and copies of the basic books started showing up at school, I did pay more attention. I later read, of course, the Holmes Basic, which was an attempt by Eric Holmes to rewrite the rules to make them easier to follow, easier to read. The Holmes book also directed people towards the new, at the time, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which we'll get to later, as a way to continue beyond the basic rules. And it only included levels 1 through 3. There's some anecdotal evidence that Holmes himself only played levels 1 through 3 and considered that sufficient to have perfectly viable long-term games. In fact, he thought that those were the funnest. So I don't know for sure why he only included levels 1 through 3, although that became kind of a staple of basic sets, but it may be because that's all he was interested in, quite honestly. Also, at about this time, well, a little bit later, the Moldvay and Cook Basic Expert box sets came out, which replaced those, but all of these were kind of still on sale concurrently. I remember being in 4th, 5th, 6th grade and seeing all of these basic books, the color Holmes, the blue Holmes, the Moldvay, and 2 slightly different covers. And honestly, I don't know that I understood the difference between them. I didn't own any of these copies at the time, but I knew a lot of people who did. I would borrow them, I would read them. I was a relatively quick student in school, so I didn't need to pay a lot of attention to still get good grades. So frankly, I read them during class when I should have probably been listening, and I don't regret it. I enjoyed that time more than I would have listening in class. The Basic Expert, the Holmes Moldvay, or I'm sorry, not Holmes, the Moldvay Cook, is probably still to this day the version of older D&D that I would be most inclined to ever play, and the one that not that I really want to play that, and I would probably not play that as written. I would probably get one of the retro clones like Labyrinth Lord and use that instead, or Basic Fantasy, or something. Old School Essentials, I guess, has become kind of the default standard for the OSR, and it's interesting to me that this BX version of the game is the one that has become the default standard of the OSR. In retrospect, it seems to have picked up a lot of esteem from older gamers. I don't know that that was necessarily true at the time. By the time it came out, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons had been out for quite some time, and most of us, probably because we were young and we saw Advanced versus Basic, and we thought, well, of course, I want to be Advanced. Seemed like most people were kind of funneled into Advanced. But I'll get to Advanced later. Let's go through like basic D&D. After just a couple years, it was revised again by Frank Menser. These are the books that had the very famous Larry Elmore covers. There's the red one, which is the basic set, which replaced the Moldvay set. It again only went through levels 1 through 3. The main difference between these versions of the game and the ones that preceded it is that it was completely rewritten and reorganized, but mechanically it was very, very similar. It was more geared towards teaching people, especially younger people, how to play the game while still giving them the same rules. So I don't know if that kind of came across as condescending to some people or not. I feel like the BECMI rules, as this edition was later called, they do have their fans, but I think that the BX, which preceded them, was kind of the more famous ones, I guess. And the way that BECMI was written by Menser, I'm not 100% sure how well that was received. It does seem, like I said, that by the time it came out, most of the people I knew were more interested in playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Although, and I actually never knew anybody who had the basic BECMI set. I will say, of the BECMI sets though, one of the things that really set them apart was the art. The famous Larry Elmore covers are among, if not literally the most iconic Dungeons and Dragons images you can get. This is especially true of the basic set, I think. Although I was always a fan of the Expert and Companion. The Expert set, like the Cook Expert set, which preceded it, was mostly focused on wilderness travel and wilderness exploration. It kind of expanded the game into that type of experience, and it was expected that as you entered that tier of levels, which was now level 4 through 14, or 4 through 13, I can't remember exactly where it cut off. I think it was 4 through 14. That was meant to kind of be the addition to your game. Rather than just doing these simple dungeons and then going back to town to sell your stuff, you're supposed to actually play out wilderness exploration and all the stuff that happened outside. This was pretty influential to me not necessarily because I borrowed a lot from this, but because I really kind of valued that. I never really had much interest in the dungeon. I never really saw the towns as just a stop to sell your stuff and buy new stuff so that you could go in and do tougher dungeons. So the wilderness exploration, which, you know, if you've ever read The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, the Book of Three, Black Cauldron, any of those, you know, books that I was reading at the time, featured an awful lot of overland travel and adventures that were happening as the heroes of those stories were traveling overland and exploring the wilderness or trying to get from one place to another. And I also, I don't know, maybe I don't know that this was true back when I was in 5th grade, but certainly it was true by the time I was in high school. I loved hiking in the wilderness. It's still another one of my major hobbies, and I love hiking and camping. Did it a lot, and I don't know, it's part of my identity. So to me, the wilderness exploration is just iconic. It has to be part of the game. If it's not part of the game, then, you know, I'm much less interested in the game. And I've always loved wilderness oriented characters. The ranger archetype, if not necessarily the class, has always been one of my favorites. And Aragorn was always one of my favorite characters from the literature that led to Lord of the Rings, or to D&D as we know it. That said, I don't know that I always loved the actual wilderness rules. It's really kind of a bunch of tables and random encounters and stuff. It's a good place to start, but I've found better systems since then that serve my purposes better. And in fact, the appendix of my own game uses one. I wrote it, but I can't claim to have invented it. It was found on a OSR-style blog many years ago and then kind of turned into a D&D Beyond product, or I don't know if it was D&D Beyond. I think I bought it on DriveThruRPG for a couple bucks. Might have even been free. I don't remember. I got that product and I was like, this is a great system. I basically adapted it to my own game. Anyway, after that, the BECMI set included 3 more volumes, which were not part of the original BX version. And they kind of went into different tiers. Each was about 10 levels, so if Expert ended at 14, the next one, Companion, which was hinted at very briefly in Expert. I think in BX they were originally going to make one, but they never actually did. But they did in the BECMI line. The Companion was more about domain play. By this point, you were supposed to manage a castle and some lands around it, and you were supposed to be a lord, and you were supposed to have armies, and you were supposed to, you know, do this, yada, yada, yada. The next tier was the Master set, which went an additional 10 levels, so you were up into the mid-30s by now by the time you finished the Master set. It, again, expanded the tier of play into more exotic stuff. I don't think either of these 2 tiers really took off. Most people today still play the game with dungeon-based and wilderness-based exploration being kind of the core pillars. And, you know, managing a domain or politics or whatever, there's been a handful of attempts to make that a core part of the game. The Birthright campaign setting, for example, and during the 2nd edition era was heavily focused on that. The ACT system, Adventurer, Conqueror, King, supposedly kind of adds this domain level play. But I don't know that very many players of D&D, certainly not the majority, actually care to do those activities because it's kind of a totally different game and a totally different genre again. But, you know, again, that's what the BECMI added. The final, the E in BECMI, the I guess I should say, was for Immortals. And this is where you basically start interacting with and becoming one of the pagan gods that most fantasy settings have that are kind of loosely based or similar to, you know, Greek or Roman or, Norse, or whatever mythology. And many products within D&D have actually started up real-world mythologies, and that's fine, I guess. For the most part, D&D kind of has its own pagan mythology, which resembles Greek, Roman, or Norse mythology, but is more modern, honestly, and is its own thing based on D&D concepts and D&D ideas. I don't know, this Immortals set was particularly different than the games that preceded it, and this was a tier of play that I don't know how many people actually ever used. I think some people bought it and thought it was interesting as a theory. I don't think very many people honestly used it, at least in my experience they don't. I don't hear anybody talking about it ever, really, other than to acknowledge that it existed. This was the state of D&D for many years. It was later kind of revised into various releases that consolidated those old 5 box sets. Really, they consolidated the 4 box sets because the Immortals was so different that it kind of was its own thing. So they consolidated the other 4 box sets into what was called the revised D&D game, and then later became the Rules Cyclopedia. A lot of people seem to forget about the revised D&D game. It was a step on the way from BECMI to Rules Cyclopedia, but a lot of people skip over it. I don't know that that's significant. I don't think it was significantly different. I think, honestly, the game changed very little. I mean, when they added, of course, these extra tiers and higher levels, that made a significant change. But once they added that, these revisions of it were really just organizational more than anything else and kind of cosmetic. I don't think the rules actually changed. Needless to say, that was kind of the state of D&D. D&D, however, was kind of put aside a little bit by TSR, if that makes sense, and they focused on Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which started coming out, and it had a long, kind of staggered release. It started coming out in the late 70s. I think it was all the way into the early 80s before all 3 of the core rule books were actually out. So I'm not quite sure how people played it. The reality, of course, is that Advanced D&D and every version of D&D up to that point were all very similar, and they all had a very high degree of compatibility. TSR and Gary Gygax himself used to run around saying that Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was a totally different game than Dungeons & Dragons and should be seen as such, but he kind of has ulterior motives for doing so because they didn't want to pay royalties to Dave Arneson, who had had a falling out with them. And D&D, of course, is co-created by the 2 of them. AD&D was solely Gary Gygax's creation, so I don't know. He tried to at least make the case that he didn't owe any royalties to Arneson on sales of AD&D. And they really kind of tried to push that game more. But like I said, it was much more compatible and similar than any version that has come since. For example, you really could use D&D and AD&D interchangeably. In fact, everybody I knew did exactly that, partly because AD&D was kind of poorly written and poorly organized, and a lot of people didn't actually understand how you were supposed to play certain elements of it, and there were a lot of rules that kind of were just offhand references in some weird little portion of the book, and people either forgot about them or never noticed them in the first place. So there was an awful lot of, well, this is how it worked in D&D, so I'm going to fill in the gaps with what I already know from D&D, and then use some of these advanced options like more monsters, more classes, more races, etc. from AD&D. This is, to me, what first edition AD&D really brought to the table, was the idea of much more customization and much more options. This is paled in in comparison to what has come since. But at the time, your basic D&D had relatively few archetypes. You had a thief and a fighter and a wizard and a cleric and an elf and a dwarf and a halfling. And that was kind of it. I mean, I'm sure there were a few more, but those are the ones that it really kind of started with. AD&D added more races. It added a bunch of classes. It had like the ranger and the barbarian, the assassin, the illusionist, the paladin, all these kind of slightly more granular takes or different archetypes that were, different spins on the basic archetypes. And that kind of became really compelling, I think, to most players. And I think that may have been another one of the reasons why AD&D was more popular than D&D. Of course, there was the marketing where they kind of sold it as, this is the real game, basics for kids, but AD&D is really where it's at. So I think that had an impact, but part of it was also the fact that you could just do more with AD&D. You could have much more customization of your character. You could have just a much richer, more interesting, and varied experience. AD&D is sometimes split into two periods. When Unearthed Arcana came out in the mid-'80s, followed by Oriental Adventures, which introduced kind of non-weapon proficiencies, followed by Dungeoneer Survival Guide and Wilderness Survival Guide, the game kind of picked up an awful lot of new elements that were then used in all the modules, in all the Dungeon and Dragon articles that kind of came out since. And this is sometimes retroactively been called AD&D version 1.5 because it was kind of treated as a somewhat significant revision to AD&D, but they couldn't call it second edition because actual second edition is, of course, second edition. But this was kind of on the way towards second edition. They added a lot of options that changed the way the game played in significant ways, made it much more complicated and complex. But by this time, I had kind of fallen out of D&D and wasn't really playing it. I remember seeing Unearthed Arcana. Some friend of mine brought it to school, and I borrowed it for a couple of days, and I think read it. Saw Dungeoneers and Wilderness Survival Guides. I don't think I ever read those. I wasn't super interested in Oriental Adventures, so I just thumbed through that at the bookstore, didn't ever buy it. But these are all the kind of the books that changed the way D&D was played. And like I said, by then I kind of had wandered out of role-playing games a little bit. I was still interested in them, but I had other things going on, and I had always been disappointed with D&D, so I just wasn't involved anymore. By the end of the 80s, or maybe the early 90s, I could look it up, but I'm not bothered to do so. Second edition came out. Second edition, among other things, incorporated an awful lot of the 1.5 changes, made them very official. It also changed a bunch of other things. It changed an awful lot of the mood and tone of the game deliberately, because I think there had kind of been some backlash from some parents that for whatever reason the TSR marketing people were very concerned about. And I think that was a mistake. I think that Dungeons & Dragons' edginess, if you will, was always a key factor in its success. And so when they kind of toned it down because there were people complaining about that edginess, I think they made the game much less compelling to its customers, quite honestly. But I'll get into second edition later because I've already been rambling for a better part of half an hour, so I think it's time to stop here. What do I pick up from D&D of the 70s and 80s? Other than, of course, the concept of playing a fantasy game specifically, and the concept of some of the basic mechanics. One of the things that I definitely learned to appreciate, especially because of AD&D, was variety in character concepts. And I think I have since come to envision the idea of mechanical variety as being less interesting than actual archetypal variety. And I don't have a ton of interest in complicated mechanics. In fact, that's one of the things that AD&D also taught me, is that I'm not very interested in the complicated, obscure, and arcane mechanics, because it was a fairly complicated game. It was very difficult to actually figure out how to play it properly, and you had to buy 3 hardcover books, which is still the case for D&D, and it's kind of considered, just what you expect in D&D now. But AD&D kind of launched that whole, you got to buy a player's handbook, a dungeon master's guide, and a monster manual, and on the basis of those 3 hardcover books, everything else is built. Now, I don't mind the idea of splat books adding more options, but the idea that you need just all 3 of those books just to play the basic game is kind of absurd. The basic game from basic, Moldvay Basic, for example, it had 2 slim booklets in the box set, a player's booklet, a dungeon master's booklet, a set of dice, an adventure, maybe a couple of other things, a pencil to color your dice. I can't remember what else it was. Some character sheets maybe. I can't remember what else they included in the box these days, but they kind of really ushered in the idea of rules light, GM rulings as kind of being the way to go. AD&D gave you more options, but the cost to some degree of those options was GM freedom, and you were supposed to use a lot more rules now because they were present and they were designed specifically for you to use them and for everybody to be playing the same. To me, that kind of lost the essence of D&D as a freewheeling game. Gary Gygax himself kind of, I don't know, he wasn't consistent in his messaging there, and I think, like I said before, he had a lot of ulterior motives in what he would say, so he can't always take everything he said at completely face value. Reading between the lines, what I think happened is that he had ulterior motives to drive sales of AD&D, and especially because in the early days of D&D, up through the early 80s or so, tournament play was extremely profitable. There was also some motivation to come up with a very consistent experience that everybody at every table would have the same experience, but I don't think that that's how Gary himself actually played the game very often. And I think that in some ways, while, in fact, he would literally say this, so it's not even reading between the lines, but it is just a little bit. I think that he was appreciative of the fact that people wanted more definition, because that gave him an excuse to write products that he could sell. But at the same time, I think he was kind of frustrated and disappointed that people didn't just make it up themselves, because in his mind, that's what the hobby was, and that's how he envisioned it initially, and he didn't understand exactly why people didn't just do that. Although he appreciated the fact that they didn't. Like I said, it gave him the opportunity to write more stuff and sell more stuff, so it's kind of like, well, hey, happy to oblige. But in many ways, AD&D destroyed the spirit of D&D. And I think, in particular in the OSR community, there has been a recognition of this over time, that although in the 80s, at the time, we kind of slithered, if you will, back and forth between D&D and AD&D, and most of our games were kind of hybrids in terms of how they were actually run. I think what people now prefer to do is a much more rules-light, D&D-like experience, which is in many ways why the Moldvay Cook set has become the de facto standard of the OSR, and most successful games and most games that people talk about playing are iterations of BX rather than of AD&D, or even of some of the other versions of D&D that were also out at the time. Anyway, I've talked way longer than I meant to, and I only got through the end of the 80s, so I'll have to do the rest in a different video. Maybe I'll even do it later today, depending on how time goes.